Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot and welcome to my monthly reflections. Today we're going to be chatting about the decks I worked with all throughout December of 2021 and taking a flip through the pages in my tarot journal. So in December, I worked with a couple of key decks for certain practices. And this is definitely something that I enjoy doing from time to time, where I kind of like dedicate a couple of decks that I'm going to work with for a very certain practice or purpose throughout the entire month. So for this month, I kind of had 3 different practices I was doing, and I used kind of 3 different sets of decks for it. So the first practice was my weekly readings, where I did a basic week ahead, kind of what do I need to know for the upcoming week every Monday. And for that, I used the EDSA Tarot and the Earth Wisdom Oracle. So for this pairing, I had the Earth Wisdom Oracle in the center, and this is one of my favorite oracles. I love the messages in the guidebook, and one of the things that I really like about this particular deck is it does list the plant and the crystals that you see on the cards, which is really nice. There's also an affirmation statement at the bottom of each entry. And I used this particular deck not only for the center focal point for my weekly readings, but I also ended up using it as my daily oracle pull in my everyday planner. So every day I pull an oracle card that I write in my planner, and for this particular practice for most of December, I ended up using this particular deck for that. And I did actually get into the guidebook and I put those I am statements into my journal. And I thought that was a really wonderful way to kind of bring some of that energy of this deck into my other daily practice that I was doing. So then I also paired it with the EDSA Tarot, which is a deck that I worked with last month as well. And I just really enjoy the way that this deck reads. It's a really interesting kind of Fae energy type of deck, which is not usually my thing, but I find that it works really well in a general sense as well. Like it's a kind of a solid reader in that sense. I really enjoyed it paired with the Earth Wisdom Oracle. I felt like the art styles were really compatible with these 2 decks as well. But the Earth Wisdom Oracle really did kind of help create a focal point, because there is a lot going on in the EDSA Tarot, and sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming because there is so much detail in the artwork. Now, this is one of those decks that I could get lost in, and I could spend quite a bit of time just diving into one card, but I really enjoyed pairing it with the Earth Wisdom Oracle as that focal point to give me something really kind of solid to key into, and then to look to where that energy was reflected within the 2 tarot cards around it. That's one of my favorite practices to do with pairing tarot and oracle, is to use my oracle decks as a focal point. And these 2 decks I think work really well together in that sense. They definitely kind of draw that energy out of each other. And the messages were really on point, and I think the artwork is just super compatible. It looks beautiful together, it reads beautiful together, and I don't think you could ask for anything more with a pairing like this. So the EDSA Tarot is a really beautiful deck that I've talked about many times on my channel in the last couple of weeks, because it has been one that I've been working with quite a bit. I've showed it in a couple of different collection videos that I've done, a couple of my favorites and kind of memorable decks from the year. And this is definitely kind of top on my list for decks that I really enjoyed working with, as well as kind of favorites from the whole of 2021, which is kind of funny because I really didn't get it till the end of the year. And a couple of my new favorites are decks that really just came in at the end of the year and I've really just started diving into. This is definitely one that I'm looking forward to continuing to work with. I really like what the creator has done with the imagery. Sometimes it is a little bit Rider-Waite-Smith inspired, and sometimes it does kind of go its own way, which I appreciate. There is a lot of elemental energy in this deck, which I also really appreciate. Again, you could pull in that Fae energy as well. It definitely feels like a deck that taps into liminal space. I love this 4 of Earth here. This kind of feels like where we are now. In my neck of the woods, we have the snow on the ground. We have the plants that are going to be struggling to come up here shortly, and I think it's just beautiful. Again, there's so much detail in this artwork that I mean, I could just lose myself in this deck for a while. Again, I feel like this is a deck that you could do some wonderful path working with, because you really could be drawn into this enchanted world that the creator has made for us here, and it's just beautiful. Again, I I've really enjoyed working with it. I've really enjoyed getting to know it, and it's definitely a deck that I'm going to be working with, I think, probably for the rest of this year. I definitely want to get to know it even better. I really want to dive deeper into this imagery. I think there is so much going on here. I think this would be a wonderful deck also for a deep dive study because there is so much going on. I mean, every time I pull one of these cards, no matter how many times it shows up on my table, I always find something new within the card, and I love that when a deck really has that much depth and that many layers to it. It really does make it a deck that I feel like I can find something new and continue to get to know even long after I've been working with it, that there's always going to be something new to discover, and I just really enjoy that about this deck. As I mentioned, I have edged mine in green, which was lots of fun. I always enjoy edging my decks when I get them. So that one was the EDSA Tarot. Then of course we have the Earth Wisdom Oracle, which is always a favorite in my collection. This is definitely one of, I think, my top Oracle decks. It works so well with so many of the decks in my collection. I really enjoy the keywords on the card. I really enjoy the artwork. I think it's really beautiful. Again, this is another one that I could kind of lose myself in. But also the write-ups in the guidebook are really good, and this is one of those oracles that I can use it without the guidebook because the keywords and the imagery are plenty to give you what you need to work with this card. But if you want to dive deeper, you can definitely get into the guidebook, and there's some wonderful messages in there. I love that it has the affirmation statements. That's just a wonderful way to kind of wrap up a reading or wrap up a card pull with this deck. And again, the artwork is just absolutely stunning. Now, I will say that I did buy the tarot deck by the same creator or by this same artist, and I really didn't connect with it. So while I do really, really love this artwork, it seems to be maybe this deck in particular, or maybe just the imagery and the theme and the keywords all working together, along with Barbara Moore's wonderful write-ups in the guidebook, that really make this deck work for me. Because the tarot deck, I think it was called the Universal Celtic Tarot, really didn't work for me. I just couldn't connect to the imagery, and I really couldn't connect to what was going on in the cards in terms of how they were depicting the tarot. But this works beautifully for me, and it's definitely one of my favorites, one that I use all the time. Even though it doesn't kind of show up on my channel a ton, it is one that I tend to pull out quite a bit because it just reads so well for me, and it's really well balanced, which I really enjoy. And I love that I have the flexibility to tap into those keywords, or to get into the guidebook, or really just take in this absolutely stunning imagery. This is of course another deck I've edged in that green to match the backs, and again, another favorite in my collection that I really enjoyed working with. I still do keep these ones in their boxes, which is kind of funny, but the boxes are nice. I don't mind boxes if they are deck sized. If everything fits in this little box like this, I'm good with that. However, I do still kind of want to make a bag. Like, there's just a thing, right? I want to make a home for my decks, but I do love that these boxes they're the same size relatively, and they do stack up really well together. So that was the two decks that I worked with for my weekly readings all throughout December, the EDSA Tarot and the Earth Wisdom Oracle. So another practice that I did all throughout December was the Merry and Bright practice prompts that I was running in my Facebook group. And for that, I was using the Greenwich Tarot, which is just an absolute favorite of mine in my collection, and the Seasons of the Witch Yule Oracle, which is another beautiful new deck in my collection that I am really enjoying getting to know. So I think of all the pairings that I did this month, this was my favorite. I really love the energy and the play between these two decks. They do feel like they are kind of made for each other. So I used the Yule Oracle quite a bit in my Merry and Bright spreads. It wasn't necessarily like a focal point as we see here, but I just used it as an addition to, or in place of, one of the card positions in those particular spreads, and I think that it worked really well for that. It does kind of provide a focal point. It kind of provides a solid keyword for the tarot to expand out from. This is a pairing that I definitely think the artwork is quite compatible, even though it is very different. I really enjoy the way these decks read together. I really enjoy the keywords on the Yule Oracle, and I think as far as just being a kind of two decks that really embody the seasonal energy of that time of the year, of Yule moving into Christmas. I think these two decks just work beautifully for that. It just had a really wonderful energy. There were really wonderful messages. So the Green Witch Tarot is a longtime favorite in my collection. Why have I not edged this deck? Like, I really need to edge this deck. I love this deck. I use it all the time. I use it for all kinds of readings. It does tend to work, I think, really well toward the later half of the year, where we're getting into the autumn and then into winter around, Yule time. But I do find that this is one that I pull out anytime throughout the year for various readings. For me, this deck very much connects into kind of the history of my personal practice, my experiences with sort of witchy things, and the paths that I have taken along the years to kind of get to where I am. That is kind of what this deck really embodies for me. And so it is one that I definitely will pull out and work with for readings in relation to that. But I do tend to want to work with it more, tend to be drawn to it more during that kind of later half of the year, the second darker half of the year. And I just really enjoy the imagery. This is one of those decks that I've had for a really long time, so it's just like a really solid reader for me. I know the imagery really, really well. I know these cards. I've mentioned it before in other videos. These people feel like old friends. Like this deck to me feels like I've come home, I've been away for a while, and these people know me, right? No matter how much time has passed between readings or between our work together, we still can have the same old conversations like we always did. It's like no time has passed. And that is really how this deck kind of feels to me, like an old friend. These are old friends that I can just come home to, and they're always there for me. And I love that about this deck. So again, that is the Green Witch Tarot. The guidebook, it's in a really old funky bag from when I very first started making bags. The guidebook for this deck is really wonderful too. But again, I've had this deck so long, like I kind of know it inside and out. So I don't feel like I really need to dip into that, but sometimes I do. And of course, we have the Seasons of the Witch Yule Oracle that I used quite a bit throughout the Yule time, Yule leading up into Christmas. I love the artwork in this deck. It just so embodies the energy of this time of the year. I'm really excited to have all of the cards, like all of the decks for each of the turn of the wheel. I think that's going to be really wonderful. I really, really like the keywords on the cards. I'm gonna be honest, like a lot of people, sometimes the writing on the card, I kind of trip over it a little bit. I do kind of wish they were not kind of written in this like old style with all the theys and the these. When you read it out loud, I trip over it more, which really I only do on videos, right? I don't read it out loud to myself very often, but sometimes I do kind of trip over those. And even when I'm like transferring them down into my journal, or I'm just reading them to myself, I do wish that it was just kind of written in like normal modern speech, I guess. But now that they've kind of done this with this deck, I feel like they kind of need to stick with it, right? Because this is a whole collection, it's a whole series of decks. But again, the artwork is absolutely stunning. The keywords are wonderful. And for a deck that embodies that seasonal energy of Yule, I think this is just like the perfect deck for that. I couldn't have asked for a better deck. I do love that they've also been working to add some more diversity to these decks, which is quite lovely. So again, that is the Seasons of the Witch Yule Oracle. It is green gilded. I have had some people ask me about, the gilding. Mine is holding up just fine. I know that isn't the case for everybody, but I haven't had any issues with it so far. It's gonna chip a little bit as gilding does, but mine's holding up quite well considering I've used it quite a bit during the Yule to Christmas season. So I think overall it works beautifully. So that is the Seasons of the Witch Yule Oracle. So let's talk about two other decks that I worked with, not really together, so I'm not going to show them together, but Throughout December, I had, for my weavers, created a collection of spreads to use for connecting to self-care during the busy time of the year. It basically ended up being one a week, so I was doing those along with my members, and for that I was using the Forest of Enchantment the first couple of weeks. And this is actually my second copy, and I've re-edged it because I wanted it in brown. I know, I'm silly. Anyway, I love working with this deck. It has such a wonderful, why is it upside down? It has such a wonderful fairy tale energy to it. I do find though that this deck doesn't like pull any punches. Like, it's not, despite the kind of fairy tale fantasy imagery, it's not like sugary sweet, right? This is not super sweet Disney fairy tales. This is like real fairy tales that there is some challenge to, and there's lessons to be learned, and there's hardships to be endured, along with all the good, hopeful, wonderful fantasy stuff that we see as well. I really enjoy working with this deck. It's one that did take me a little bit to kind of come around to, and it really took me reading the guidebook. Again, this is another one of those that I feel like you kind of need to read the guidebook to kind of get what's going on in all the depth and the layer in this particular deck. I know that the changing of the suit titles has been a stumbling block for a lot of people. And it was for me in the beginning, to be perfectly honest too. It took me a while to kind of remember what was what, because we have, you know, challenges and boons and spells, and there is not a single pentacle or cup or sword in this deck. And that's totally fine. I mean, if you're gonna change them, right? If you're gonna do it differently, do it differently. And I'm all on board for that. I'd much rather they all be changed than you know, just one or two things changed for no particular reason. I don't know why this deck is all kinds of wonky. Who knows what I did when I pulled it off my table. But anyway, I really enjoy working with this deck. The artwork is just fantastic. And I do work with this deck, I think, a little bit more kind of in that numerological elemental association, which I do is the way that I prefer to work with my cards anyway. So this deck works really well for me for that. Anyway, I love working with this deck. It's one of my favorites. It's one I do tend to come back to again and again. And I used it just for some basic kind of self-care readings throughout December, which was interesting because it's not really a self-care deck. I definitely wouldn't consider it one. It's definitely a deck that, like I said, it doesn't pull any punches, but I love the imagery. I love the artwork. I love kind of being taken into this fairy tale world. And I think maybe because I was sort of already in that place using the for Hexa and the Green Witch Tarot and the Seasons of the Witch Yule Oracle, I was kind of already in that place. And so I felt like this was just a great deck to kind of pull me even deeper into that kind of mystical, magical energy of the season, even though it's not really one I would consider like a winter or a Yule or a Christmas deck. It did actually work really well for that, and I quite enjoyed working with it. So again, that one is the Forest of Enchantment Tarot, and that was one of the decks that I worked with for my holiday readings. So another deck that I worked with for holiday readings toward the latter part of the month, and then to be perfectly honest, have continued to work with for many other things since, is the Northern Animal Tarot. This deck, you guys, I've talked about this deck I think in a couple of different videos maybe. I've already edged it. Here's the backs. This is the imperfect version, which is totally fine. I don't know exactly what the imperfection was. The backs have slightly different shades, which I've mentioned. It does not bother me. I actually kind of like it. Like, I don't know if that's intentional, but I like it. I think it looks cool. Again, I've already edged mine, and when I edged it, I actually took my corner rounder, as I mentioned, and I used the large side of my corner rounder and I re-rounded all the corners just to kind of soften it up a little bit. And I really love the way that it turned out. It was really fun to do as well. And this deck, you guys, I'm just enjoying working with this deck so much. It is very much a Waite-Smith inspired deck. It's very much based on that system. And so it's a really easy reader in that sense. But I just find this artwork so charming. It just makes me smile. It makes me happy whenever I work with it. It's definitely one that I've been gravitating toward quite a bit, which is funny because I'm not real big into animal decks, but I really dig this animal deck. This one works for me. I think I mentioned this Three of Swords here. This is my only real disappointment with this deck, just because I get it, it's traditional, but I feel like we could have done something different with that. And again, there's no animal, so I would have liked to have seen an animal and something a little bit different there, but I just absolutely adore this deck. I adore working with it. The images are so cute. I get such great readings with it. This deck did come with a bunch of extra cards too, which I've set out. I don't actually use them, but I have enjoyed kind of looking through them and getting to know them as well. But it's just such a cute, solid reader. This, I believe, is the first edition. I think the second edition is either in pre-order. It has some sort of Kickstarter going on, I think. Some sort of crowdfunding. I will definitely check and leave a link for you in the description box below so you can go check it out if you are interested. I know that this one has the flimsier cardstock, and I have mentioned that I actually quite like it. It's quite thin, but it's a sort of long deck, and I think I did this in the last video that I showed this deck in too, but I can get my hands around it, but it's like just barely. If it were any thicker, I wouldn't be able to, but it shuffles like a dream, and it just is like a, I don't know, it's like a book. That's the only way I know to describe it. It's like a book. It does have different hierophants. This is the one that I've chosen to keep into my deck. But it's just, yeah, it's such a charming little reader. I so enjoy working with it. It's got beautiful linen cardstock. I do like how thin and easy it is to work with. I was afraid that maybe it wouldn't hold up. Like when I was edging it, I was like, oh my goodness, these are so thin on their own. But they're holding up really well. They shuffle beautifully, and I'm really enjoying working with them. It hasn't been an issue at all. I've had no trouble working with this deck, even though it's thin. That death card is awesome. Just, yeah, such a pleasure to work with. I'm so glad that I finally went ahead and got this one. It's been a really wonderful experience working with it. I'm definitely looking forward to working with it some more in the new year, because it's one that is still hanging out on my table and hasn't gone anywhere. So that is the Northern Animal Tarot. So we've talked about decks. Now let's take a flip through my tarot journal and check out the pages that I created in December. So here was the cover page that I created for December. I put this kind of gold dotted vellum over the top. I just tipped that in where I basically ran some tape, cut it down to size, taped it in here. So it sits over the top of my cover page. My cover page, I just drew a tree with a star, very Christmassy, right? Stamped out the month, and then wrote the decks that I worked with throughout the month. That's just one of my favorite ways to create a cover page, is to just list out the decks that I worked with, because I've actually found that really handy when going back through my journals, to be able to just pop in to the cover page and see real quick at a glance the decks that I worked with primarily throughout the month. Granted, there are other decks that I pull in and out of my rotation throughout a month, you know, decks that I'm like always working with, say like my Llewellyn. But it's good to see the decks that I work with for certain practices and for certain things throughout the month. And I found that actually really handy throughout this year. So moving into our first weekly reading, again, working with the Verhexe and the Earth Wisdom Oracle, you'll see that I went pretty minimalistic overall this this month, and I just wrote the Monday real big. I have my little doodle, my stamped date. This is the keyword from the Earth Wisdom Oracle. When I copied these cards, a lot of times they came out a little bit dark and I wasn't able to really read what was on them, so I just stamped it out here. And I wrote the I am statement from the guidebook down at the bottom. Again, that's what kind of gave me the idea to use this in my everyday carry planner as well. And I have my tarot cards around it, my reflections on my reading for what I kind of need to keep in mind for the coming week. And I just edged it in this little black line. That again just gives me a real quick indication that this is my weekly reading because I did them all the same. So this was the first Merry and Bright prompt that I did. It was the reason for the season, and you can see here that it really was just a 3-card reading. I used 2 of the tarot cards from the Green Witch, and then I used the Yule Oracle, and then we had the prompts here and my reflections for each one, and that was on December 1st. Now, this was the readings that I did for every Friday. I did the Weaver holiday spreads from the collection that I provided to members, and I didn't quite like get a layout that I liked. Like, I like to keep things in certain layouts, right? This was the layout that I used for my weekly readings because I know every time I flip through here that that's what that was. This was the layout and kind of design I did for Merry and Bright. And then when it came to this one, this was a hot mess. Like, if I were to go through and find like my least favorite tarot pages, tarot journal pages, this would be up there because I hate this page. But I got the information, and that's the main thing, right? I have my cards, I have my reflections, I have my prompts. It's all good to go, right? That's the main thing. I just don't like the way that I designed it. In fact, I don't like the way I designed any of the pages where I used this deck, but that's okay. So moving into the next week, we have again my 3-card spread with my Oracle focal point in the middle and my tarot around it. And you can see I'm just pulling in sort of elements, doodle elements from the card, usually from the for Hexatarot. Again, I have my keyword from my Oracle stamped out here and the affirmation statement from the guidebook, my reflections, and the line around it, which tells me this is my weekly reading. You know, as if the big Monday didn't clue me into that, right? I was also using my little date stamper all throughout. I started that, I think, in October or November, and I really enjoy that. That's probably something I'm going to keep going in the next year. So here we have our Merry and Bright with the little light spread, again, using my Oracle and my Tarot. I did pull some of the text from the Yule guidebook in here. I have my prompts, and then I have my reflections. Wonderful little spread. I really enjoyed this process throughout the month. There were other prompts that I did here and there, but I really only recorded the larger spreads in my tarot journal. The rest of them I kind of just did as I went along. And again, we're back to the Weaver holiday spreads, and I don't like this page either. I just couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with this. And that sometimes happens in my tarot journal where I'm like, I just don't know how to put this all together. And it comes out looking totally weird, and it's totally fine, right? It's totally fine. One of the things that I think that this also indicates to me was there was a bit of a disconnect, I think, between me and the practice, not the decks, right? Not the deck, because the deck is fine. I've used it many, many times, and I don't have any issue with working with the Force of Enchantment Tarot. But I think the first couple of spreads that I did with this deck and trying to record it in here, I was just having a bit of a disconnect, and I think that's because it was just such a busy time for me. I was like almost trying to just squeeze these readings in. And I think that's definitely what happened. I would get to the end of the week and I'd be like, oh my goodness, I haven't done my Weaver holiday spread yet. And so I squeeze it in, like kind of last minute at the end of the day. And I think that's definitely reflected in those first 2 that I did, like, right? This is me just kind of phoning it in. And that's okay. That happens. As I mentioned many times, my journal doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be Instagram worthy all the time, YouTube worthy all the time, right? This is my actual working journal. And so as long as I get what I need in here, that's the main thing. But yeah, I kind of hate this page. That's okay. I love the rest of them. So that's always good. So moving into the next week, again, still working with my 2 decks for my weekly readings, just pulling in some of those doodles. I had some fun with pulling in some of the flowers from the 10 of Water here. Again, stamping out my keyword, my focal point, the I am statement, and then my reflections. I really like this one, the way it came out. I have a tendency to doodle this way. You've probably noticed if you've seen some of my other journal flip throughs or any of my other planners. I love floral doodling like this. It's just one of the things that I enjoy most when I doodle, and so I tend to do it a lot. So here we have the next Merry and Bright with the North Star spread. And this one is very, very simple in terms of like what I did in my tarot journal, right? Here's my cards. I get asked all the time about how I put my cards in. I do have a whole video, a whole 3-part series on how I create my tarot journals. I'll leave that linked in the description box below. Long story short, I throw them on a scanner, shrink them down roughly 50%, cut them out and paste them in. That's the process. So that's what I did here, pasted them in. I think I tried to keep them pretty much in the configuration that because the spread is actually in a star, but I have my prompts over here and then I have my reflections, and that's really all that's on here, right? And I just drew some snow and that's it. Like, it's just my cards, some writing and some snow, and that's about it. But it works, right? It works. So here we are moving into the next Weaver holiday spread, and this is when I started working with the Northern Animal Tarot. I was much more excited to work with it. Again, not that I don't love the Forest of Enchantment, but this was new and I was really excited to work with it. So I did this whole like crazy blanket thing going on over here. It's supposed to be a blanket. I tried to do like the you know, like this. Tried to do that. I don't know how well it came out, but anyways, it works. I could still read it. So this was the Comfort and Joy spread, and we have my prompts here, my reflections, and then these were my cards, and I just put some stickers in. I definitely like this layout a little bit more. This is a little bit much. I kind of wish I hadn't done that, but I mean, it's fine. It's cute, right? All right, so moving into the next week, we have my 3-card reading. I drew this little spider because this dang card with its spiders. So I put one down here. And then we have the flowers that I pulled in kind of from this card, from the rest card. I like to also pull in elements in terms of the imagery that I'm connecting with. So for me, like connecting with the spider energy here, I think was really key to working with the 8 of air. And then rest, I think that idea of rest, particularly at this time in the month and in my life and what was going on, that idea of rest was really key. Like I really did need to get some rest, to kind of just take a step back and take some time for my own needs as well. And so I pulled the flowers out of that card as a visual reminder that this was really important. I want to focus in on that. So moving into our next Merry and Bright spread, we have my 3 cards, my prompts, my reflections. Again, really, really simple, just kind of a title that I created here, my date stamp, and snow that I doodled on here, which I don't know if will even show up on camera, but snow is really easy to doodle. You just do open circles and then smaller dots. Super quick and easy, and it's cute. So here we have our Happy Holidays recipe spread from the Weaver's Holiday Spreads. And again, working with the Northern Animal Tarot, which I loved. I like the way this one came out a little bit better. It's a little bit easier to read, which is always great. I have my prompts, my reflections, and again, just some stickers, some dots, stickers and dots. Always a great way to fill a page. So moving into the last week, I do love the way that this one came out because I had a lot of fun creating or trying to sort of create this little bush plant going on here. I wanted to kind of pull that down into the page. We have my stamped out keyword, the I am statement from the guidebook, and then of course my reflections here. This one was a lot of fun to do. I mean, it's still pretty simple, but it's just a little bit of fun doodling and I enjoyed it. Again, really love these 2 decks together. They just worked beautifully. So here we have the Merry and Bright Lighting a New Path spread. I feel like this reading for me was really kind of spot on, which was wonderful. Love the way that these decks work together. I did pull out the text from this particular card because sometimes I do think that it resonates really well for me. I have my prompts and my reflections. And again, just snow on the page. And finally, we have the last spread. Yes, the last spread of the month, which was the releasing expectations from the Weaver holiday spreads. And then we have the prompts, we have my cards, my reflections, and again, just some stickers to just create a little bit of interest on the page, but I really tried to keep it pretty simple and sweet. So that is the pages that I created in my tarot journal for December. I'm really looking forward to my tarot journal for 2022 because I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. This book that I've been using, I have a fresh one for the new year, is going to be dedicated to the Weaver Monthly Medicine, which is going to be fun. And then I'm going to be changing out some of my inserts. So we'll see that next month when I show that and what I've done there. But yeah, it was a really great month of decks. I really enjoyed diving into the kind of fantasy, mystical, magical world this time. And it was a really interesting shift for me to move away from some of my more, let's just say, Christianized decks, which I do enjoy, to my more kind of earthy, pagan-inspired decks. And that was really quite an interesting shift. I do work with this style decks most of the year. And in the past, I've tended to work more with those sort of Renaissance style decks in December. And this year, it was really interesting to kind of shift that focus, kind of come back to these decks for the year. And I do have to say that I really enjoyed that. It is a bit more in alignment with my practice now, whereas I feel like the other decks would have kind of been more in alignment with my childhood, my past. This feels more kind of in alignment with where I am now in my practice. But it was really interesting to kind of shift that focus for the month because, you know, I tend to work with my decks very seasonally. I tend to have certain decks that I work with during certain months, and it was really interesting to shift away from that and do something a little bit different, which was kind of inspired by really wanting to work with these 3 decks here. And I really did enjoy my work with them. They're definitely decks that I think I'll be using quite often. The Earth Wisdom Oracle I always use. It's kind of a staple in my collection. The Yule Oracle, I don't know that I will pull out much until the sort of winter months roll around next year. I do feel like because each of those have a season, I do kind of want to use them in conjunction with their season. However, I will say that the Samhain Oracle does get used quite often in my new moon practice because I feel like the messages and the energies in that work really well. The For Hexa Tarot is one that I definitely will be working with, I think, again, in the coming year. We have, of course, the Forest of Enchantment, which is always a favorite. The Green Witch Tarot, which is definitely always a favorite, and my new Northern Animal Tarot, which is one that I am still working with because that's how much I enjoy it. So those were the decks that I worked with all throughout December of 2021, the pages that I created in my tarot journal. So I hope that you had a wonderful December, a wonderful end to your 2021, and I'm wishing you many blessings moving into January and this bright new year.